The rusted wrench slipped from Mike Carter's calloused hands as he heard the first scream pierce through the afternoon silence of Pinewood Elementary's parking lot. Through the chain-link fence separating his auto shop from the school grounds, he watched a small girl with dark braids stumble backward, her pink backpack scattering crayons across the asphalt like broken promises. 3 boys, twice her size, circled her with the practiced cruelty that only children could master. Mike's jaw tightened as memories of his own son Ryan's bruised ribs from last month flashed before his eyes. He'd sworn never to get involved in other people's problems again, not after what happened overseas. But as the girl's quiet whimper reached his ears, something deep inside his chest began to crack. "Hey!" The word tore from his throat before his mind could catch up, his work boots already carrying him toward the fence. Mike Carter had built his life around routines that kept the ghosts at bay. Every morning at 6:15, he'd wake up in the cramped trailer he shared with his 10-year-old son Ryan, brew coffee strong enough to strip paint, and walk the 50 yards to Carter's Auto Repair, a generous name for the converted garage where he fixed whatever broken-down vehicles the people of Killeen, Texas could afford to keep running. The work was honest, simple, and required just enough concentration to keep his mind from wandering to places it shouldn't go. Ryan would catch the school bus at 7:45, always with his homework done and lunch packed, because Mike had learned the hard way that structure was the only thing standing between them and the chaos that had claimed too many of his former brothers-in-arms. The afternoon routine was just as sacred. Ryan would walk the 3 blocks from Pinewood Elementary to the shop, do his homework at the makeshift desk Mike had built from scrap wood and car parts, then help with simple tasks until closing time. It wasn't much of a life, but it was theirs, and Mike had fought too hard for normal to let anyone threaten it. That's why the scene unfolding beyond the fence hit him like a physical blow. The dark-haired girl couldn't have been more than 9 years old, her school uniform neat despite the assault, her chin raised in defiance even as tears streaked down her cheeks. The boys taunting her wore the kind of expensive sneakers and designer backpacks that marked them as base kids, children of officers who thought their parents' rank made them untouchable. Mike knew that look in the girl's eyes, had seen it in his own mirror during the worst nights when the medications couldn't quiet the screaming in his head. She was trying to be brave, trying to convince herself that words couldn't really hurt, that tomorrow would be different. But Mike also knew how quickly that hope could die, how easily a child's spirit could break under the weight of daily cruelty. His own son had come home with that same forced smile too many times, making excuses for bruises and torn clothes until Mike had finally confronted the truth that Ryan was paying the price for his father's reputation as the local crazy veteran. The chain-link fence was 8 feet high and topped with barbed wire, but Mike had scaled bigger obstacles under enemy fire. His body moved on instinct, muscle memory from a dozen combat deployments overriding the careful civilian persona he'd spent 3 years constructing. The metal rattled and sang as he climbed, and by the time his boots hit the school's asphalt, the 3 boys had turned to face this unexpected threat. They were perhaps 12 or 13, old enough to recognize danger when it came walking toward them with the measured pace of someone who had learned to kill efficiently and quietly. "Leave her alone." Mike's voice carried the kind of authority that didn't require volume, the tone that had once made hardened soldiers snap to attention in the mountains of Afghanistan. The boys exchanged glances, their juvenile bravado wavering in the face of something they didn't understand but instinctively feared. The largest of them, a blond kid with his father's arrogance written across his features, tried to rally his courage. "This is school property, mister. You can't just—" The words died in his throat as Mike stepped closer, close enough that the boy could see the old shrapnel scars along his forearms, the way his eyes never quite focused on any one point, always scanning for threats that existed only in memory. But it was the girl who surprised him. Instead of cowering or running, she stepped forward, placing herself between Mike and the boys with a protective instinct that seemed far too mature for her age. "It's okay," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears. "They were just leaving." There was something in her posture, a straightness to her spine and a set to her shoulders that spoke of military-bearing, learned young. Mike had seen it before in the children of career officers, that unconscious mimicry of parade rest that marked them as clearly as their father's insignia. The three boys scattered like leaves before a storm, their expensive sneakers slapping against concrete as they disappeared around the corner of the building. Mike watched them go, then turned his attention to the girl, who was methodically gathering her scattered crayons with the same precise movements he'd seen in junior officers trying to maintain composure after their first taste of combat. "You hurt?" he asked, crouching down to help collect the art supplies. She shook her head, not trusting her voice, and Mike noticed the way she kept glancing toward the school's main entrance, as if expecting reinforcements that would never come. "I'm Emma," she said finally, when the last crayon had been returned to her backpack. The name hit Mike like a punch to the gut, though he couldn't quite say why. Something about the way she carried herself, the careful way she spoke, triggered a memory he couldn't quite grasp. "I'm Mike," he replied, standing slowly and offering his hand in the formal manner he'd learned from countless meet and greets with local officials overseas. She shook it with the firm grip of someone who'd been taught that first impressions mattered, and Mike found himself wondering what kind of parent taught a 9-year-old to conduct herself like a diplomat. "Those boys bother you often?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, and Mike immediately regretted crossing that line. He wasn't a counselor or a teacher or anyone with the right to involve himself in this child's problems. He was just a broken-down veteran trying to keep his own demons at bay. But something about Emma's quiet dignity made him want to stand guard against a world that seemed determined to crush anything pure and innocent. She considered the question with the seriousness of someone weighing classified information. "Sometimes," she admitted, they think my family is responsible for things that happened to their families. Things I don't really understand." The pieces began clicking into place with the terrible clarity of an incoming mortar round. Base kids, officer families, a child bearing the weight of decisions made in windowless rooms by people who would never see the consequences of their orders. Mike had lived through enough deployments to know how the game worked, how the brass sent good soldiers into impossible situations and then disappeared behind their oak desks when the body bags started coming home. He'd also seen what happened to the families caught in the crossfire, the wives and children who became targets for anger that couldn't reach the real decision-makers. "Your dad's military," Mike said. It wasn't a question. Emma nodded, and something in her expression suggested this wasn't the first time her father's profession had made her life complicated. He has an important job. Sometimes people don't like the choices he has to make." The careful way she spoke, the diplomatic phrasing, told Mike more than she probably intended. This wasn't just any officer's daughter. This was someone whose family lived in the spotlight, whose father's decisions affected headlines and casualty reports and congressional hearings. A cold certainty began forming in Mike's chest, the kind of recognition that came with seeing a familiar face across a crowded room. He'd served under enough generals to recognize the particular brand of composure that came from growing up in the highest echelons of military command. Emma Hayes. The name echoed in his memory, connected to briefings and operational orders, and a woman's voice crackling through radio static as she authorized missions that would send good soldiers into harm's way. General Catherine Hayes, the Iron Lady of Central Command, who'd made the call that sent Delta Team 7 into the mountains of Kandahar on a mission that should have been a simple extraction, but turned into a nightmare that still woke Mike in cold sweats. But he couldn't be sure. Not yet. And even if he was right, what did it matter? This was just a child who needed protection from bullies, not the daughter of the woman whose orders had gotten his best friend killed and left Mike with a medical discharge and a head full of shrapnel, both literal and metaphorical. He forced himself to focus on the present, on the girl standing in front of him, with grass stains on her uniform and trust in her eyes despite everything she'd been through. "Well," Mike said, managing what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Important job or not, nobody has the right to pick on you." He glanced toward the school building, where a few teachers were beginning to emerge for afternoon bus duty. "You got someone to walk you home? Or a ride coming?" Emma shook her head, and Mike felt another piece of the puzzle snap into place. A general's daughter walking home alone from a public school in a military town with no security detail and no staff car waiting. Either the family was being very careful about maintaining a low profile, or there were circumstances he didn't understand yet. "I usually walk," Emma said, adjusting her backpack straps with the same precision she'd used to gather her crayons. "It's not far." But Mike had seen the way she'd glanced over her shoulder when the boys ran off, the unconscious way she'd positioned herself to keep the school building at her back while they talked. This wasn't a child who felt safe walking anywhere alone, and Mike found himself making a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation he'd developed since coming home. "Tell you what," he said, pulling out his phone and checking the time. "My son Ryan gets out in about 10 minutes. He walks this way, too. How about you wait here with me until he comes out, then you can all walk together? Safety in numbers and all that." It was a reasonable offer, the kind of thing any concerned adult might suggest. But Mike knew he was crossing a line from uninvolved bystander to something more complicated. The smart thing would be to walk away, go back to his garage, and pretend he'd never seen Emma Hayes getting picked on by a bunch of military brats with too much anger and not enough supervision. Emma considered the offer with the same careful deliberation she'd shown earlier, and Mike realized she was probably weighing risks and benefits the way most kids her age worried about homework and playground politics. Growing up in a military family, especially at the general officer level, meant learning early that trust was a luxury that could get people hurt. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." The fact that she remembered his name from their brief introduction impressed him, but it also reinforced his growing certainty about who she was. General's kids learned early to remember names and faces, to file away details that might matter later. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching as buses began lining up, and teachers started organizing the controlled chaos of elementary school dismissal. Mike found himself studying Emma from the corner of his eye, looking for more clues to confirm or deny his suspicions. The way she stood at parade rest without thinking about it. The unconscious way she scanned their surroundings, always aware of potential threats and escape routes. The expensive but understated clothing that spoke of a family with money, but not the need to show it off. All of it pointed to one conclusion, but Mike wasn't ready to deal with the implications of that recognition. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the school parking lot in shades of amber and gold that reminded Mike of better times, before the war and the nightmares and the long slide into the kind of existence that could charitably be called surviving. He'd built a life here in Killeen, modest and careful and deliberately unremarkable, because anonymity was the only armor he had left against a world that wanted to use his pain for its own purposes. Politicians who'd never heard a shot fired in anger loved to trot out broken veterans as props for their speeches about supporting the troops, while the same system that had broken them offered inadequate treatment and empty promises. But standing here next to this brave little girl who faced down bullies with the kind of quiet courage he'd seen in the best soldiers he'd ever served with, Mike felt something stirring that he'd thought was dead forever. Not the rage that had sustained him through the worst of his recovery, or the bitter cynicism that had carried him through the transition to civilian life, but something warmer and more dangerous. Hope, maybe, or the possibility that his own suffering might mean something if he could use it to protect someone who reminded him why the fight had mattered in the first place. The sound of the dismissal bell echoed across the playground, followed by the thunder of hundreds of small feet racing toward freedom. Mike watched for Ryan's familiar figure among the streams of children pouring out of the building, and found himself thinking about the conversation they'd need to have tonight. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that sometimes doing the right thing means accepting complications you're not ready for? How do you tell your son that the woman whose daughter you've just decided to protect might be the same woman whose orders turned your life into a waking nightmare? Ryan appeared in the crowd, his dark hair falling across his forehead in the same stubborn way it had since he was a toddler. He spotted Mike immediately and changed direction, jogging over with the easy confidence of a child who'd never doubted that his father would be there when needed. It was only when he got closer that Mike saw the fresh bruise along his son's jawline, partially hidden by the fall of his hair, but unmistakable to someone who'd learned to catalogue injuries the way other people noticed the weather. "Dad?" Ryan's eyes moved from Mike to Emma and back again, taking in the situation with the quick intelligence that had always made Mike proud and worried in equal measure. Smart kids noticed things, asked questions, made connections that sometimes led to uncomfortable truths. "This is Emma," Mike said, keeping his voice casual. "She had some trouble with some older kids, so I thought you two could walk together for a while. Safety in numbers." Ryan nodded, accepting the explanation without question, but Mike caught the way his son's eyes lingered on Emma's tear-stained cheeks and the defensive way she held herself. Children recognized their own kind, and Ryan had dealt with enough bullies to understand exactly what had happened here. "Those base kids again?" Ryan asked, and Mike felt his heart sink as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. His son's bruises, Emma's harassment, the particular brand of entitled cruelty that came from children who'd learned that might made right from fathers who commanded thousands. It wasn't random. It was systematic, the kind of coordinated campaign that suggested adult involvement, or at least adult indifference to what their children were doing in their name. "We can talk about it later," Mike said, but he was already making mental notes, cataloguing details the way he'd once prepared mission reports. Who were these kids? Which units were their fathers assigned to? Was this organized harassment or just the natural result of putting too many aggressive personalities in one place? Most importantly, was Emma being targeted because of her father's rank, or because of specific decisions that had made enemies within the military community? As they started walking, Emma fell into step beside Ryan with the easy synchronization of children who'd learned to navigate hostile territory together. Mike watched them from behind, these two kids who'd been forced to grow up too fast in different ways, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a rucksack full of ammunition. He'd signed up to protect and serve once upon a time, had taken an oath that technically ended with his discharge, but had never really left his heart. Seeing Emma face down those bullies with quiet dignity had reminded him that some battles were worth fighting even when you couldn't win the war. The walk to Emma's neighborhood took them through the heart of Killeen, past the usual collection of pawn shops and fast food restaurants that clustered around every military installation like barnacles on a ship's hull. Mike knew the route well. It led toward the nicer part of town where the senior officers lived, the tree-lined streets with actual sidewalks and houses that looked like they belonged in suburbia rather than a military encampment. It was a world away from the trailer park where he and Ryan had built their careful life, but close enough that a determined 9-year-old could walk between them without too much difficulty. Emma stopped in front of a modest 2-story house that looked government-issued despite its civilian address. the kind of temporary quarters that career military families learned to call home. Mike noticed the discreet security measures, cameras that weren't quite hidden, reinforced door frames, windows that were probably bulletproof, and felt his certainty crystallize into cold fact. This wasn't just any general's daughter. This was the child of someone important enough to have enemies, someone whose decisions affected more than just unit assignments and training schedules. "Thank you," Emma said, turning to face them with the formal politeness of a diplomat's daughter. "Both of you." She looked at Ryan with particular attention, and Mike realized she was filing away details just as he had, memorizing faces and names against future need. "Maybe we'll see each other tomorrow." The question was directed at Ryan, but her eyes flicked to Mike as if seeking permission or approval. Children of military families learned early that friendships were temporary things, subject to deployment schedules and security considerations, and the endless shuffle of personnel that defined military life. "Sure," Ryan said, with the easy certainty of someone who'd never doubted that tomorrow would come. "We walk this way every day after school." Mike felt a moment of pride at his son's automatic kindness, the way Ryan had accepted Emma as a friend without needing explanations or background checks. It was exactly the kind of open-hearted response that made children excellent judges of character and terrible security risks. But Mike didn't have the heart to complicate it with adult worries about consequences and complications. As they walked away from Emma's house, Mike found himself glancing back more often than was probably wise. The girl had disappeared inside, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, evaluated, assessed for threat potential or usefulness. It was paranoia, probably, the result of too many years spent in places where a moment's inattention could get you killed. But it was also the kind of healthy paranoia that had kept him alive long enough to make it home, and Mike had learned to trust his instincts even when he couldn't explain them logically. "She seems nice," Ryan said as they reached the trailer park. "Sad, though, like she's carrying something heavy." Mike looked down at his son with a mixture of pride and concern. When had Ryan become so perceptive about emotional burdens? When had a 10-year-old learned to recognize the weight that broken people carried in their shoulders and their eyes? The answer, Mike realized with uncomfortable clarity, was by living with a father who carried his own invisible wounds and thought he'd hidden them better than he had. "People deal with hard things differently," Mike said, unlocking the trailer door and stepping into the cramped space they called home. "Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who look the most fragile." It was a lesson he'd learned the hard way, watching good soldiers break under pressure, while others who seemed weak found reserves of strength that carried them through hell. Emma Hayes had that quality, that core of steel wrapped in vulnerability that marked natural survivors. She'd need it, if she really was who Mike thought she was. That evening, as Ryan worked on homework at the kitchen table and Mike tried to focus on inventory reports for the shop, his mind kept drifting back to the afternoon's encounter. He'd crossed a line today, involved himself in something that could complicate the careful equilibrium he'd built since coming home. The smart thing would be to forget about Emma Hayes, to treat today as a one-time good deed and return to the anonymous life that kept his demons manageable. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing up to those bullies with quiet courage, and he knew that forgetting wasn't an option. The phone rang at 9:37, according to the digital clock on the microwave. Mike answered on the second ring, expecting a customer with car trouble or maybe Ryan's teacher with concerns about missed assignments. Instead, he heard a woman's voice that made his blood freeze in his veins, professional and controlled and unmistakably familiar, even after 3 years of trying to forget it. "Mr. Carter, this is General Catherine Hayes. I believe you met my daughter today." Mike's hand tightened on the phone until his knuckles went white. The voice belonged to nightmares, to after-action reports written in blood, to the crackling radio transmission that had sent Delta Team 7 into the mountains of Kandahar with intelligence that turned out to be 3 days old and completely wrong. He'd imagined this conversation 1,000 times during the worst nights, practiced the words he'd say if he ever got the chance to tell General Catherine Hayes exactly what her orders had cost. But now, faced with the reality, all he could manage was silence. "Mr. Carter?" The general's voice carried the same crisp authority it had possessed when she'd briefed them on the mission that would leave 2 good soldiers dead and Mike carrying shrapnel in his skull for the rest of his life. "I understand you helped Emma this afternoon. I wanted to thank you personally." The words were carefully chosen, professional courtesy wrapped around what Mike recognized as intelligence gathering. She was probing, trying to determine how much he knew and whether he represented a threat to her family's carefully maintained security. "Just the right thing to do," Mike managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Ryan looked up from his homework, concern flickering across his features at the change in his father's tone. Mike forced himself to breathe, to remember that his son was listening, that whatever history existed between him and General Hayes couldn't be allowed to contaminate this moment. Any parent would have done the same. The lie came easier than the truth, because the truth was that most parents would have called the school and let someone else handle it, would have avoided getting involved in military politics and the complicated dynamics of base families. "Perhaps," General Hayes said, and Mike could hear the doubt in her voice. She knew exactly who he was, had probably run his name through military databases the moment Emma mentioned the helpful mechanic who'd scared off her tormentors. His service record would have told her everything she needed to know about Sergeant First Class Michael Carter, his medical discharge, his decorations, and most importantly, his connection to the operation that had ended his military career. "I was hoping we could meet, Mr. Carter. There are things we should discuss." The invitation felt like a trap, but Mike recognized the steel beneath the diplomatic phrasing. This wasn't really a request. It was an order dressed up in civilian clothes, the kind of summons that generals issued when they wanted to control the narrative before it could spiral beyond their influence. Mike had seen it before, the way senior officers managed potential problems by keeping them close, offering explanations or threats, or whatever combination worked best to maintain operational security. The fact that her daughter was involved only made the stakes higher. "I don't think that's necessary," Mike said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Like I said, just helping out a kid in trouble. Nothing more to it than that." But even as he spoke, Mike knew it was already too late for simple explanations. He'd involved himself in Emma's life, had made himself visible to people who preferred to operate in shadows, and now the careful anonymity he'd built since coming home was crumbling like sand castles before an incoming tide. "Mr. Carter." General Hayes' voice carried a note of warning now, the same tone she'd used when briefing junior officers on the consequences of mission failure. "My daughter's safety is not something I take lightly. When strangers insert themselves into her life, I prefer to understand their motivations." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Cooperate, or face the full weight of military bureaucracy deployed against a disabled veteran living in a trailer park with his son. Mike felt the old anger rising, the same fury that had sustained him through months of physical therapy and psychological evaluation. 3 years ago, he'd been one of General Hayes's expendable assets, a non-commissioned officer, whose life could be risked for operational objectives determined by people who would never see the consequences of their decisions. Now she was treating him like a potential threat to be neutralized, as if his only value was as a problem to be solved. The irony was bitter enough to taste. "My motivation," Mike said slowly, "was keeping a little girl safe from bullies. If that makes me suspicious in your book, General, then maybe you should look at who's really threatening your daughter's safety." The words were out before he could stop them, years of suppressed resentment finally finding voice. Ryan was staring now, recognizing the edge in his father's tone that meant trouble was coming whether they wanted it or not. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, heavy with unspoken history and mutual recognition. General Hayes knew exactly what Mike meant. The bullies weren't random kids acting out. They were the children of officers who blamed her for decisions that had gotten their friends killed, their husbands wounded, their brothers shipped home in flag-draped boxes. Emma was paying the price for her mother's command decisions, just as Mike was still paying for his willingness to follow orders without question. "Tomorrow," General Hayes said finally. 1000 hours. The coffee shop on Rancière Avenue, downtown. Come alone. The line went dead before Mike could respond, leaving him staring at the phone while his heart hammered against his ribs. Ryan had abandoned all pretense of homework and was watching his father with the wide-eyed intensity of a child who'd learned to read adult moods as a survival skill. "Dad?" Ryan's voice was small, uncertain. "Are you okay?" The question hit Mike harder than he'd expected, because the honest answer was that he hadn't been okay for 3 years and probably never would be again. But okay was a luxury that single fathers couldn't afford, especially when their children were depending on them to hold the world together with nothing but determination and stubborn pride. "I'm fine, buddy," Mike said, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass. "Just some grown-up stuff I need to handle tomorrow. Nothing for you to worry about." But he was already calculating risks and contingencies, thinking about what would happen to Ryan if this conversation with General Hayes went sideways. The boy had no other family, no safety net beyond Mike's ability to keep functioning despite the metal fragments in his skull and the nightmares that still woke him most nights. That night, Mike lay awake staring at the ceiling of the trailer while Ryan slept peacefully in the next room. Through the thin walls he could hear the sounds of the trailer park settling into uneasy rest, televisions murmuring behind closed doors, the distant hum of air conditioners fighting against Texas heat, the occasional cry of a baby whose parents were probably wondering how they'd ended up here, instead of the suburban dreams they'd planned before deployments and injuries and the grinding reality of post-military life. Mike had rehearsed this confrontation so many times that he'd worn grooves in his memory, playing out scenarios where he finally got to tell General Catherine Hayes exactly what her operational decisions had cost. But now that the moment was approaching, he found himself thinking less about revenge and more about consequences. What did she want from him? Was this about Emma's safety? Or was there something larger at stake? And most importantly, how could he protect his own son from the fallout of a war that was supposed to have ended when they came home? The next morning dawned clear and hot, with the kind of relentless sunshine that made everything in Texas feel bleached and brittle. Mike dropped Ryan off at school with the usual warnings about staying close to teachers and avoiding trouble, but he found himself watching the playground longer than usual, cataloguing faces and noting which children seemed to travel in aggressive packs. Emma was nowhere to be seen, and Mike wondered if General Hayes had already moved her daughter to a different school, a different city, a different life that didn't include complications like broken veterans with inconvenient memories. The coffee shop on Rancière Avenue was exactly the kind of neutral territory that military officers preferred for delicate conversations. Public enough to prevent violence, private enough for sensitive discussions, civilian enough to avoid the formal protocols that governed on-base meetings. Mike arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table with clear sight lines to all entrances, old habits reasserting themselves despite his civilian clothes, and carefully cultivated normalcy. The other customers were mostly young soldiers from the base, grabbing caffeine before morning formations, their conversations a familiar mix of complaints about NCOs and speculation about deployment schedules. General Catherine Hayes entered at exactly 1000 hours, her civilian clothes unable to disguise the military bearing that marked her as clearly as dress blues and ribbons. She was smaller than Mike had expected, more compact than the imposing figure who'd dominated briefing rooms and commanded respect through sheer force of competence. But her eyes held the same steel he remembered from the video conferences that had preceded every major operation. The calculating intelligence of someone who made life-and-death decisions with incomplete information and lived with the consequences. She ordered black coffee and took the seat across from Mike without ceremony, her movements economical and precise. For a moment, they simply studied each other. Two veterans of the same war meeting on neutral ground to discuss terms for a peace neither of them entirely wanted. Mike found himself cataloguing details. The faint scar along her left temple that spoke of shrapnel or flying glass, the way she kept her hands visible on the table, the unconscious way she positioned herself for quick movement despite the civilian setting. "You look better than your medical records suggested you would," General Hayes said finally, her voice carrying the same dry observation Mike remembered from operational briefings. "The doctors weren't optimistic about your recovery." It was a statement of fact rather than sympathy, acknowledgement of shared knowledge rather than an attempt at emotional connection. Mike appreciated the honesty, even as it reminded him of everything he'd lost in the mountains of Kandahar. "I had motivation to get better," Mike replied, thinking of Ryan's face the day he'd finally come home from the military hospital, the way his son had clung to him as if afraid he might disappear again. "Amazing what you can accomplish when someone's depending on you." The words carried their own weight of accusation, because General Hayes had had her own motivations when she'd sent Delta Team 7 into that valley, objectives that had seemed more important than the lives of the soldiers tasked with achieving them. "About that," General Hayes said, leaning forward slightly, "I want you to know that the intelligence failure that led to your team's casualties was not something I took lightly. I've carried the responsibility for that decision every day since." Her words were careful, chosen for their precision rather than their emotional impact. Mike recognized the language of official after-action reports, the bureaucratic phrasing that acknowledged fault without accepting legal liability. "Responsibility," Mike repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "That's what you call it?" He kept his voice low, conscious of the other patrons but unable to completely suppress 3 years of accumulated anger. "Danny Morrison was 23 years old, General. Had a wife and a baby daughter he never got to meet. Tommy Rodriguez was supposed to rotate home in 2 weeks. They died following your orders based on intelligence you knew was questionable." General Hayes' expression didn't change, but Mike caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested his words had found their mark. "The intelligence was the best available at the time," she said. "The mission parameters required immediate action to prevent greater casualties. I made the decision I believed would save the most lives." It was the same justification Mike had heard in a dozen debriefings, the utilitarian calculus that reduced human lives to acceptable losses in service of larger objectives. "And now your daughter is paying the price for those same kinds of decisions," Mike said, watching General Hayes carefully for her reaction. "Those kids picking on Emma aren't random bullies, are they? They're the children of people who blame you for choices that got their family members killed or wounded. The sins of the mother, visited on the daughter." It was a cruel observation, but Mike found he had no reservoir of kindness left for the woman whose orders had shattered his life. For the first time since sitting down, General Hayes showed a crack in her professional composure. Her hands tensed on the table, and Mike saw something that might have been pain flicker across her features before the mask slammed back into place. "Emma is innocent of any decisions I've made in my professional capacity," she said quietly. "She doesn't deserve to suffer for them." The admission carried more weight than any official apology could have managed. Acknowledgement of a burden that Mike suddenly realized she carried as heavily as he carried his own. "No," Mike agreed. "She doesn't. Just like Danny and Tommy didn't deserve to die for decisions made by people who would never face the consequences personally." The parallel hung between them like an accusation, but Mike found that speaking it aloud had drained some of the poison from the wound. Revenge, he realized, was a luxury he couldn't afford when there was an innocent child caught in the crossfire. "What do you want from me, General?" Mike asked, genuinely curious about her endgame. "You didn't call me here just to relitigate ancient history. Your daughter is being bullied by military brats who blame you for their family tragedies, and somehow I'm supposed to be part of the solution. So what's the play?" He'd learned to read military thinking during his years of service, understood how officers approached problems in terms of objectives and resources and acceptable risk levels. General Hayes was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if it might contain answers to questions she hadn't known how to ask. When she looked up, Mike saw something he hadn't expected. Vulnerability, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. "Emma told me about yesterday," she said. "Not just what happened with the other children, but how you handled it. She said you made her feel safe without making her feel weak. That's not something she experiences often." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications that Mike was only beginning to understand. He thought about Emma's quiet dignity under pressure, the way she'd positioned herself protectively between him and the bullies, the careful composure that spoke of a child who'd learned early that showing weakness could be dangerous. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Since the congressional hearings 2 years ago," General Hayes said. "When my testimony about operational decisions became public record, certain families felt I hadn't been sufficiently forthcoming about the human cost of those operations. They weren't wrong exactly, but full disclosure would have compromised ongoing missions and gotten more people killed. Emma has been paying the price for my choice to protect classified information over personal reputation." Mike felt his anger shifting, transforming from personal grievance into something more complex and harder to define. General Hayes wasn't just the cold-blooded commander who'd sent his team into a death trap. She was also a mother trying to protect her daughter from consequences that were spiraling beyond anyone's control. The realization didn't absolve her of responsibility for what had happened to Delta Team 7, but it complicated his desire for simple justice in ways that made his head ache. "What do you need from me?" Mike asked again, this time without the edge of confrontation. He was still angry, would probably always be angry about Danny and Tommy and the life he'd lost in those mountains, but Emma's safety had to take priority over his need for revenge. Some battles were worth fighting even when you couldn't win the war, and protecting an innocent child from the fallout of adult decisions was exactly the kind of mission that had made him join the army in the first place. "I need someone Emma trusts to keep her safe when I can't," General Hayes said simply. "Someone who understands the threats she faces and has the skills to handle them. Someone who won't be intimidated by military politics or worried about career advancement." She paused, meeting Mike's eyes directly. "Someone who has every reason to hate me, but might care about her anyway." The request was audacious in its scope and implications, asking Mike to become personally invested in protecting the daughter of the woman whose orders had destroyed his life. But as he considered the offer, Mike found himself thinking less about his own grievances and more about Emma's quiet courage the previous afternoon, the way she'd faced down bullies with the kind of dignity that reminded him why he'd signed up to serve in the first place. "What kind of arrangement are we talking about?" Mike asked, his tactical mind already working through the logistics of providing security for a general's daughter without the official resources or authority that such a mission would normally require. "I'm not exactly Secret Service material these days, General. I fix cars and try to keep my own son safe. That's about the extent of my operational capacity." "I'm not asking you to be her bodyguard," General Hayes said. "I'm asking you to be her friend, someone she can trust, someone who'll notice if the threats escalate beyond schoolyard harassment, Someone who'll act if she needs help, and I'm not available. The proposal was simultaneously simpler and more complicated than anything Mike had expected, asking him to provide something more valuable than physical protection. Genuine human connection from someone who understood the cost of military service. Mike thought about Ryan, about the careful life they'd built in the shadow of the base, about the risks and complications that would come from accepting this responsibility. But he also thought about Emma standing up to those bullies with quiet courage, about the trust in her eyes when she'd shaken his hand, about the way she'd instinctively moved to protect him from potential violence, despite being half his size and a quarter his age. "There's something else," General Hayes said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Emma doesn't know about my connection to your military service. She knows I've made difficult decisions that have affected families, but she doesn't know the specific details of any particular operation. I'd prefer to keep it that way, at least for now." The request was reasonable, but loaded with implications about trust and secrets and the careful balance required to maintain operational security while building genuine human relationships. "Understood," Mike said, though he wondered how long such secrets could be maintained in a community as small and interconnected as a military town. "But if she asks direct questions, I won't lie to her. Kids deserve honesty, even when the truth is complicated." It was a principle he'd learned from his own experience with Ryan, the understanding that children could handle difficult truths better than adults often assumed, as long as those truths were presented with appropriate context and support. General Hayes nodded, accepting the condition without argument. "There's one more thing," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out an envelope that looked official despite its civilian packaging. "Your medical discharge was classified as 20% disability, based on the shrapnel injuries and associated trauma. The evaluation was incomplete. Recent reviews have suggested that rating should have been higher, much higher. This represents a corrected assessment along with back pay for the difference." Mike stared at the envelope without touching it, understanding immediately what it represented. Not just money, though the financial implications were staggering for someone living on disability checks, and the modest income from a small auto repair shop. This was acknowledgement, official recognition, that his sacrifices had been greater than the military had initially been willing to admit. It was also, unmistakably, compensation for services not yet rendered, payment in advance for protecting General Hayes' daughter from threats that the official system couldn't address. "I can't accept this," Mike said, though the words felt like pulling teeth. Ryan needed new clothes for the approaching school year, the trailer's air conditioning was on its last legs, and the shop needed equipment upgrades that Mike had been putting off for months. The money represented security, stability, the chance to build something better than the hand-to-mouth existence they'd been managing since his discharge. But it also represented strings attached, obligations that went beyond simple friendship with a lonely little girl. "It's not charity," General Hayes said firmly. "It's what you should have received from the beginning. If the evaluation process hadn't been compromised by budget considerations and bureaucratic incompetence. The fact that it comes at a convenient time for both of us doesn't change the fundamental justice of the correction." Her logic was sound, but Mike recognized the political calculation beneath the moral argument. She was making it easier for him to say yes by framing acceptance as justice rather than bribery. Mike picked up the envelope, feeling its weight both literal and metaphorical. Inside was the means to give Ryan a better life, to upgrade the shop, to build something lasting instead of just surviving day to day. But there was also the weight of obligation, the understanding that nothing in the military world came without strings attached, even when the strings were wrapped in ribbons of honor and duty and mutual benefit. "Emma goes to Pinewood Elementary," General Hayes said, continuing as if Mike's acceptance was a foregone conclusion. "She walks home most days, takes the route past your shop. Her after-school schedule is flexible. No formal activities, no structured programs. She's essentially on her own from 15:30 until I get home from the office. The information was delivered with military precision, but Mike heard the underlying concern of a mother who knew her child was vulnerable and had limited options for protection. Ryan gets out at the same time, Mike said, his mind already working through the practical arrangements. They can walk together, maybe stop by the shop to do homework before heading home. Natural enough that it won't look like a security detail. He was thinking like a soldier again, planning operations and contingencies, and the familiarity was both comforting and unsettling. 3 years of civilian life hadn't erased the tactical instincts that had kept him alive through multiple deployments. "Thank you," General Hayes said, and for the first time since sitting down, her voice carried genuine emotion rather than professional courtesy. "You don't know what this means to me, Mr. Carter. Emma she's everything I have left. The rest of it, the career, the recognition, the historical significance, none of it matters if I can't keep her safe." The admission was more personal than anything Mike had expected from their conversation, a crack in the professional armor that revealed the human being beneath the rank and title. Mike nodded, understanding better than she probably realized. Ryan was his anchor to sanity, the reason he got up every morning and faced another day of managing trauma and building something resembling a normal life. The idea of that anchor being threatened by forces beyond his control was the stuff of nightmares, literal and metaphorical. "I'll take care of her," he said simply, meaning it in ways that went beyond the practical arrangements they'd discussed. They finished their coffee in relative silence, each lost in thoughts about the complications they'd just introduced into their carefully ordered lives. Mike found himself studying General Hayes' face, looking for traces of the woman who'd made the decisions that had cost him so much. But all he saw was a mother worried about her daughter's safety, someone who'd been forced to choose between professional obligations and personal relationships and was still paying the price for choices made under impossible circumstances. As they prepared to leave, General Hayes handed him a business card with contact information that included personal numbers normally reserved for family and close friends. "If anything happens," she said, "anything at all, you call me immediately, day or night, regardless of what I might be doing officially. Emma's safety takes priority over everything else." The instruction was clear and unambiguous, granting Mike access to the highest levels of military command in service of protecting one vulnerable little girl. Mike walked back to his shop with his mind spinning, trying to process the morning's revelations and their implications for the carefully structured life he'd built since coming home. The envelope in his pocket felt heavier than its actual weight, representing not just financial security, but a return to the world of military obligations and unclear objectives that he'd thought he'd left behind forever. But when he thought about Emma's quiet courage the previous afternoon, about the trust in her eyes and the protective instinct she'd triggered, he knew he'd made the right choice, regardless of the complications it would bring. That afternoon, Emma and Ryan walked to the shop together as if it had been planned for weeks rather than arranged that morning through a series of phone calls and careful coordination. Mike watched them through the window as they approached, noting the easy way they fell into step with each other, the animated conversation that suggested genuine friendship rather than mere convenience. Children, he reflected, were remarkably adaptable when adults didn't complicate things with too much explanation and worry. "Dad said you might want to do homework here sometimes," Ryan said as they entered the shop, his voice carrying the carefully casual tone of someone who'd been coached on what to say and what to keep private. "He's got a desk set up in the back and there's usually sodas in the fridge." The offer was natural enough, the kind of arrangement that military families made all the time to accommodate irregular schedules and changing circumstances. Emma accepted the invitation with the same careful courtesy she'd shown the previous day, settling into the makeshift study area with her books arranged in precise lines and her pencils sharpened to identical points. Mike recognized the organizational habits of someone who'd learned early that chaos could be dangerous, that maintaining control over small things was sometimes the only way to manage larger uncertainties. He'd seen the same compulsive neatness in soldiers who'd survived too many close calls, the unconscious need to impose order on whatever environment they occupied. As the days turned into weeks, the arrangement settled into a routine that felt natural, despite its artificial origins. Emma and Ryan would arrive at the shop each afternoon, complete their homework with the kind of quiet cooperation that suggested genuine friendship, then help with simple tasks until it was time to head home. Mike found himself looking forward to their conversations. The way Emma's careful questions revealed a sharp intelligence and curiosity about the world beyond the carefully controlled environment of military life. She never asked directly about his service or the scars that marked his arms and hands, but Mike caught her watching sometimes when she thought he wasn't paying attention, cataloguing details with the same careful observation he'd noticed that first day. Children of military families learned early to read the signs of trauma and loss, to understand that some stories were too painful for casual telling, but too important to ignore completely. The threats against Emma didn't disappear, but they became more manageable with Ryan as her constant companion and Mike's shop as a safe haven, where she could decompress from the daily stress of navigating hostile territory disguised as elementary school. The bullying shifted from physical intimidation to whispered comments and social exclusion, the kind of psychological warfare that was harder to address, but easier to endure with allies nearby. Mike found himself thinking less about revenge against General Hayes and more about the future he was helping to build for both children. Emma's quiet courage was rubbing off on Ryan, teaching him that strength wasn't always about fighting back, but sometimes about refusing to be broken by circumstances beyond your control. In return, Ryan's natural optimism was giving Emma something she had been missing, the belief that tomorrow might actually be better than today, that friendship could exist without hidden agendas or strategic objectives. 3 months after that first afternoon encounter, Mike was closing the shop when he noticed a black sedan parked across the street, its occupants too professional and too alert to be casual observers. His combat instincts kicked in immediately, cataloging escape routes and potential weapons, while simultaneously calculating the threat level to the children still inside doing homework. But before he could act on his growing paranoia, his phone buzzed with a text message from General Hayes. "Security detail, threat level elevated, maintain normal routine, details tomorrow." Mike's blood ran cold as he processed the implications. Someone had escalated beyond schoolyard harassment, had moved into the realm of actual physical threats that required professional intervention. Emma was still just 9 years old, still innocent of her mother's command decisions. But the adult world of military politics and generational revenge was closing in around her with the inexorability of an incoming artillery round. That night, after he'd delivered both children safely to their respective homes and confirmed that the security detail was maintaining discreet surveillance, Mike sat in his trailer staring at the phone number General Hayes had given him. He'd thought he was signing up to protect a lonely little girl from schoolyard bullies, but it was becoming clear that the threats were more serious and more complex than anyone had initially realized. The war, it seemed, wasn't over after all. It had just moved to a different battlefield, and now Emma was the primary target instead of him. But as Mike considered the weight of responsibility he'd accepted, he found himself thinking about Emma's trust and Ryan's growing confidence, and the way protecting something precious could give meaning to sacrifices that had once seemed pointless. He'd lost Danny and Tommy in the mountains of Kandahar, had come home broken and angry and convinced that nothing he'd suffered had served any useful purpose. But maybe, just maybe, those losses had prepared him for this mission. Protecting an innocent child from the fallout of decisions made by adults who thought they understood the true cost of military command. The envelope General Hayes had given him still sat unopened in his dresser drawer, representing a future he hadn't quite decided to claim. But as Mike thought about Emma and Ryan doing homework together at his makeshift desk, about the careful way she'd learned to trust him despite every reason for suspicion, about the quiet strength she'd shown in the face of harassment that would have broken most adults, he realized that some payments weren't about money. Some obligations were about honor, about choosing to stand guard over something precious, even when you couldn't be sure the effort would matter in the end. Tomorrow, he would call General Hayes and get the details about whatever threat had prompted the security upgrade. Tonight, he would check the locks on the trailer door and make sure his service weapon was cleaned and ready, just in case the war that had followed him home decided to escalate beyond anyone's ability to contain it. Because sometimes the most important battles weren't fought for flag or country or strategic objectives, but for the simple right of children to grow up safe and innocent and unaware of the prices that others had paid for their protection. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the Texas landscape, carrying freight toward destinations unknown. Mike listened to its lonely call and thought about journeys that began in one place and ended somewhere entirely different, about the unexpected ways that duty and honor could intersect with healing and hope. Emma Hayes had needed protection, and somehow protecting her was teaching Mike that his own wounds might finally be ready to heal. It wasn't the ending he'd planned for his story, but it was the ending he'd been given, and maybe that was enough.